On page 3 of Adventuring for Christ, George Evenson tells the story of the Scandinavians who arrived on the Pacific coast of Lower Mainland British Columbia at the time of the Pacific Gold Rush. Some around Lower Mainland British Columbia, around Vancouver, and others all the way up to Bella Coola. Around the 1850s, the gold rush had prompted people to migrate to the Pacific coast from all across the continent and, in some cases, all around the world. The gold rush clustered highly diverse groups of people from across the North American continent and around the world, right at the point in history that Gordon spoke of at the last webinar. Right then, right when Lutheranism was about to experience continental realignments. At this moment in history, some of the Lutherans were incredibly well-resourced, and others, men, women, and children, were exceedingly poor, vulnerable, living often hand to mouth. When the Nidaros and Mount Zion Congregational Centennial History was published in 1991, included in the excellent resource was the focus of 8 women standing in front of a quilt, holding a variety of sewing, and the caption read, "Ladies Quilting." The text read, quote, "The ladies continue to make many beautiful quilts, layettes, and baby clothes, which are sent to CLWR, together with kitty kits, which sometimes have been assembled by the Sunday School. In addition, used clothing has been gathered in aid of the native people of BC and the Salvadorian refugees," end quote. In their congregation's history book called The First 100 Years, their story is presented in chapters that help readers make the connection between their congregational history, Canadian Lutheran history, and Canadian and world history. That CLWR is featured in their book is notable. They write, quote, "The ELW continues many of the projects begun in previous years. Gifts of Christmas baking are made for some of the members of the congregation. Christmas gifts are collected for the Canadian Mental Health Association, and money and gifts are forwarded to CLWR, the Lutheran Association of Missionary Pilots, LAMP, Saskatoon Lutheran Seminary, Lutheran Bible Translators, Canadian Bible Society, and Vancouver Seamen's Mission," end quote. The roots of compassion for these ladies quilting go back long before 1991. The compassion of these coastal peoples goes back to their very foundations, and part of their foundation was their landing on the lower mainland of British Columbia, back between the gold rush and the early 1880s. It goes back to before the women formed the ELW, the Evangelical Lutheran Women, and back before that to when they formed the Women's Missionary Federation, and back before 1904 when they formed the New Westminster Norwegian Ladies Auxiliary. It goes back even before to the founding of the congregation in 1890. Leaders from the Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish communities gathered at Runge Martinson's home on Park Lane near the Great Northern Depot to create a congregation whose purpose was to, quote, "proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ to all Scandinavians living in Vancouver," end quote. And soon thereafter, a congregation was founded, and almost immediately after that, a women's organization came to be, but it goes back before the congregation because it started when the women started to arrive with their families and looked around and asked themselves, how can we provide support to our family, to our congregation, and to our community? To put this into perspective, when Pastor Tollefson was coming north from Seattle to serve the Scandinavians of Lower Mainland, BC, it was concurrent with the first missionary, Heinrich Schmieder, to Manitoba, and to his beginning his service from Manitoba into Assiniboia. In 1890, when First Scandinavian Vancouver was started, Pastor Schmieder was moving into Edenwold. And not only were the Scandinavians of Lower Mainland, British Columbia, being served by Pastor Tollefson of the Norwegian tradition, it is written in another of the congregational histories that Pastor Svante Uden had come from Manitoba by train, and he was also providing support to them. He was baptizing children along the route in the rail cars on the railroad, and the Lower Mainland Scandinavian Lutherans were also receiving support from missionary Daniel Nelson, who was delayed in Vancouver on his way to mission in China, delayed by 6 months while he was awaiting his papers. And with his help, the congregation was able to find a location for a worshiping community in a Chinese mission church. And the history reads that it stood on piles on the river front near the foot of what is now 10th Street in New Westminster. This congregation called Pastor Tollefson, and then Pastor Saugstad, and thereafter Pastor C.J. Olson, and under Pastor Olson, a church and a parsonage were built. And here's another great aspect of the story. One of the congregational histories reads thus. When Pastor Olson decided to return to the United States in 1896, the congregation had no funds with which to repay him the $500 owed on both properties. 3 women, Mrs. Sven Hofford, Mrs. Jacob Olson, and Miss Anna Risen, later Vance, came to the rescue. These 3 women purchased both properties from Pastor Olson and kept ownership of them until 1905, when the congregation had sufficient funds to buy them back. It may have been due to these 3 women's ownership of the congregation's facilities, or maybe male chauvinism just passed away quietly on the evening of the 5th of July, 1900. But at a congregational meeting on that date, the men of First Scandinavian Lutheran Church voted to give all women of the congregation the vote and all the privileges of membership. This was a radical decision in the context of the society in which they lived. It was a decision that was far ahead of its time, since the suffragette movement for the enfranchisement of women was only at its inception. The story continues that in 1909, Mrs. Nielsen was elected to church council and served as a deacon. And this was provided by Pastor Yuk Klong Chong. He writes, "Many years ago, war and natural disaster forced a northern China people to move. Some came to Malaysia, where the Basel Switzerland Mission Society brought them the gospel. They were strangers in the land, so they adopted the name Hakka, guests. Some of these emigrated to Sabah, then called North Borneo. World War II left churches and schools in Sabah devastated. The Lutheran World Federation assisted in rebuilding. Some Hakka moved to Canada. They settled in Vancouver and began meeting for worship in private homes, bound together by their common but rare dialect. In 1982, First Lutheran Church took them in. Basil Haka Lutheran Church organized in 1983 and sent a call to Pastor Yuk Klong Chong in Sabah. He arrived in 1984. The present building was purchased at a court order sale. By amazing coincidence, the building turned out to be the original home of First Lutheran, the congregation that had supported their missions. It moved me particularly to read this conclusion to this history by an unknown writer who is remembering the story of their congregation and writes, First Lutheran Church has over the years stressed the use of one's gifts within the life of the congregation rather than one's sex and sex role. As a result of this, women have played an active part in the whole life of the congregation. This has become increasingly evident with their participation in the worship services as lectors, assisting ministers who assist in the singing of the liturgy, and communion assistants. History came full circle on Friday evening, July 1, 1983, when Reva Nelson was ordained in First Lutheran Church. Not only is Pastor Reva Nelson the first woman to be ordained in the Lutheran Church in British Columbia, but she is also the great-granddaughter of Pastor Daniel Nelson, who in 1890, while passing through Vancouver on his way to China, ministered to and encouraged the Scandinavian Lutherans to organize themselves into First Scandinavian Lutheran Church of Vancouver. All of this combined provides a perspective that we rarely hear in Lutheran Church history in North America or in Canada. In 1890, these women were taking a significant amount of leadership in their congregation. By 1905, they had vote and voice in their congregation. And they had been proud to celebrate that they were a congregation who had one of the first ordained women in the Lutheran Church in Canada. And so, thanks to the congregational histories that were written down by the lay leaders around about 1991, we can understand the connection between the ladies quilting and their predecessor men and women of Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, and Chinese heritage that have impacted their coastal compassion. The reason why in 1991 they are still connected to CLWR and offering support not just to their own families and their own interests, but compassion to their community and their congregation and people far and wide who they don't know through CLWR. Samuel Schmucker grew up in Hagerstown, Maryland. He was the founder of Gettysburg Seminary in Pennsylvania, the most significant school of the General Synod. By the time Schmucker was born in 1799 in Hagerstown, Maryland, the 1793 Act to limit slavery in Upper Canada had already been passed, and efforts to abolish enslavement were well underway from Nova Scotia all the way to Lake Huron. Schmucker was 36 when the Slavery Abolition Act came into effect in Canada, and he was 62 when the American Civil War over slavery started in the United States. Mark Granquist is on record as referencing Gettysburg as a stop on the Underground Railroad to destinations we would now think of as being in the Eastern Synod. One of the earliest students of Gettysburg Seminary was William Passavant, a distinguished missionary leader of the Pittsburgh Synod, and Gottlieb Bassler, his close associate in mission development. In the summer of 1846, Samuel Schmucker and William Passavant, as I mentioned, were attending the General Council of the Evangelical Alliance. Passavant's ship en route to Europe hit rocks and ended up in Halifax for 2 days, at which time Passavant went to the Lutheran Little Dutch Church. He learned of the local and the Lunenburg Lutherans. Then he resumed his journey, and Passavant and Schmucker attended the conference. And Schmucker went one way in the exploration and contemplation of American Lutheranism as opposed to other national Lutheranisms. But Passavant traveled to Kaiserwerth, Germany, where he was inspired by the diaconal ministry of Theodor Fliedner and the women who worked as deaconesses in the Ministries and Missions of Mercy at Kaiserwerth. Fliedner and 4 deaconesses came back to North America with Passavant, and together in 1849 they created the first Protestant hospital in North America. In 1849, Passavant and Fliedner and the Pittsburgh Synod were working on missions of mercy, hospitals, and orphanages, and this ministry was going to spread. It was also going to lead to the theological education of women at the General Synod's seminary in Gettysburg, and also in Maryland, and finally in Hartwick Seminary. All 3 of these seminaries are important seminaries in early Canadian Lutheranism. Also in 1849, as Passavant was rolling out the first hospital with the mission committee of the Pittsburgh Synod, he was walking to the end of the road at the meeting at Klecknerville, and there he found in a garden, barefoot, Adam Keffer from Canada West, who had come to ask the Pittsburgh Synod to send a Lutheran pastor to the Lutherans north of Toronto in what we have known as Von Markham. In September, after the Klecknerville Mission Committee meeting, Bassler himself visited the Keffer Lutherans and surveyed the field from Vaughan Markham all of the way to Lake Huron. His mission trip took a month, and a year later, Pastor Charles Frederick Deal was sent to the Keffer Lutherans to begin work for the Pittsburgh Synod. In years to come, Deal was joined first by Worcester and then by Fishburne, these three Gettysburg graduates, and an additional Lutheran colleague. Between June 16 and 18 of 1853, formed with Bassler and Passavant's help, the Canada Conference of the Pittsburgh Synod. Four months later, the clergy of the Canada Conference of the Pittsburgh Synod joined with Poplau and F. Meisner of the New York Ministerium, along with Jacob Holsch of the Ohio Synod, and the pastors of these three separate Lutheran synodical bodies formed in 1853 the Evangelical Lutheran Union of Canada, and together they committed, quote, to making it the duty of the ministers to supply destitute congregations with word and sacrament, end quote. In the creation of this intersynodical alliance, the clergy of the General Synod and its mission committee were aligned all the way from Halifax to Lake Huron, including both Gettysburg and Hartwick graduates. These clergy, serving many congregations, were of the same position on enslavement, because that had been settled in Canada in the 1830s, and of the same position on the diaconate and women in advanced theological education, because that had been settled in the Pittsburgh Synod beginning in 1849. More evidence that the alliance stretched that far includes that when Pastor Bowers arrived in Lunenburg to support Dr. Kossmann in 1855, he was a recent graduate of Gettysburg and Hagerstown seminaries, and his theological education was considered sufficient enough that Dr. Kossmann permitted his daughter Louisa Kossmann to marry Pastor Bowers. So between 1853 and 1855, Lutherans in Canada were in relationships across linguistic groups, German and English, and amongst immigration enclaves, colonial Europeans established in the 1700s, Loyalists, and later in-migrating Lutherans moving north from the United States, and later immigrants arriving in the mid-1800s from Germany and Scandinavia, and there was agreement about ministries that mattered to Canadians. And all of this was before Johann Adam Ernst started the first Missouri Synod congregation in Canada at Fisherville in 1854. And all of this was for the 1855 release of the Theological Thought Exercise on American Lutheranism, written by Samuel Simon Schmucker, Benjamin Kurtz, and Samuel Sprecher of Wittenberg College, that was circulated anonymously. And all of this was before American Lutherans began to fight over the abolition of slavery in what Mark Granquist calls the national trauma. And so, before the General Synod imploded, in the years between 1855 and 1865, there had been this moment in Canada where concord in Canadian Lutheranism wasn't just an imagining, but it was a reality in hand, and then it disappeared. Quoting esteemed Canadian historian Desmond Morton, after Gettysburg, the North could be certain of victory, and no one knew what dangers that might bring to Canada, as the huge military potential of the United States was mobilized for the Civil War. British strategists came to the cold realization that they could never repeat the victories of the War of 1812. In 1864, a trusted staff officer confirmed that without a massive effort no British government could afford, the Canadas were indefensible. Confederation had been a means to many ends. By 1867, one purpose mattered more than the others: the bid to establish a transcontinental nation.